Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. I've got a roommate with a quirky personality. He doesn't care for people he doesn't know, but if I'm home, he'll usually follow me around the house and yap my ear off. He's a picky eater and he's pretty lazy. As a matter of fact, one of his favorite activities is to sit on the couch and watch TV. Oddly enough, he's not a habitual guy. He'll sit in different chairs around the house, go to bed early some nights and stay up late others, and eat at random times. But whenever we play cards on Sunday morning, he always wants to sit in the same chair. My chair. You probably guessed by now that my roommate is a cat, an old guy named Leo. And while we often refer to our pets as having personalities, not many people actively consider animals as persons. Today we're going to take a closer look at personhood.
Oh, Leo. I didn't see Leo this morning.
No, he's at the vets today, so he's getting checked out. Like I said, he's an old guy, so he's losing some weight, and he's got to get checked up. But yeah, so that kind of demonstrates some of the complex issues of personhood that we're gonna look at today, and we'll start off with the unanswerable question that we're going to sort of pick at as we go through the show. But what is a person?
It's one of the most immense questions there is, because I think we have to start from the notion that right from the get-go, person and what we like to say a human, very rapidly, especially as centuries moved on, but very rapidly those two words became not synonymous. And so at the very basis of it, back at the very beginning, philosophers were saying that which has matter which has spirit. The quality or condition of being an individual person. Well, that's a tautological thing. There's an old Etruscan word, fursu, comes with the Latin overlaid on it, and it means a theater mask or an actor's role. So you can be many persons if you happen to be human. In the 1200s, an individual, a human being, and it still was associated with drama. And in the 19th century, something that you sound through. So the mask, but if let's you make the mask metaphor, whatever's in us is sounding through the persona that we cast. So person has persona or personae, more than one iteration, so to speak. And so it's bound up with all of those things, but essentially it's to say something that what we've arrived at in our own time is something that has consciousness. And it wasn't just in our own time, it was up through, we'll talk about the philosophers that messed with it, but up through the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century up until now is a being with consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah, we're gonna
we know what we do with consciousness. We've been there. So.
Yeah, I'm gonna pick at that a little bit as we go along. But no, very interesting things emerging already just based off of the language of personhood, right? And I think that sort of the through line there, the thing that kind of exists throughout history in the language is this idea that personality is a layer on top of something else, right? Yeah. And I think that that's not necessarily the way that we think of it in modern times, right? I think we sort of associate personality with consciousness, which we identify as being the core of who we are. And so that's just the central thing. Whereas the language, and the historical sort of usage tends to indicate that there's a core thing underneath and that personality is this mask on top. So
it seems to be that way, but then when you, and I'm not jumping the shark, but I have to lay this in here because of what you said. It seems to be that way, but ultimately, personhood is down to legal status, so that the law can be changed to determine who's a person and who's not. And we've seen that happen in our own history. We're seeing that happen now. And so the assumption that a person is a human and therefore everyone is equal, doesn't exist. And so that itself is a construct. Mm-hmm. It goes with personhood that way. Also, there's this adjacent thing for me of, well, what other words do we associate with the word hood as a suffix? Fatherhood, motherhood, childhood. You think of anything else?
Yeah, it's really...
So there's this narrow club.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. No, and that's a really good point that we're going to explore throughout the episode, is this sort of idea of kind of, and we've talked about in previous episodes, the danger of language in some regards, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. It's once, with many things, if you put it into a category, you start to conceptualize it a certain way. And personhood is a very dangerous concept, I would say, in terms of who gets in and who doesn't.
That's precisely it, and it's why it's so important. To me, this is a critically important topic because of that danger, because of that incendiary nature that it can be used and turned into and shaped and morphed by entities. That it's not naturally a given. The way Boethius in the 6th century, Boethius said, changed it slightly, an individual substance of a rational nature. Doesn't help a whole lot, because then Locke and Kant and some of them tore at that, but pretty much not just spirit or consciousness, but it has to be rational.
Yeah.
And then we have to ask what we mean by rational, and we'll
right.
get there.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's a good illustration, and talking about how ancient conceptions of, or ancient usages of the word and modern conceptions kind of conflict. What have philosophers historically said about personhood? Well,
Boethius, as I just said, I'm going to go back and forth because there's just lots of stuff. John Locke said that self-consciousness is necessary to personhood, and self-consciousness means that the person or the matter that we're made of is ontological, really, the being of us, can conceive itself as itself. In other words, can you look in the mirror and say, that's me? I can construe that is me, and that means that I have consciousness or an awareness, which we've talked about before. Immanuel Kant says, adds this moral, it starts to become this moral layer, and that gets really dangerous too. So it says that to be a person is to have an end in itself. Personhood is having an end in itself. You have your own projected intent, and you're carrying through in your life to achieve that intent. But that requires the earlier part that Locke was talking about, is being able to conceive of yourself, and therefore project yourself back in time and forward in time, and in context and in hypotheticals. So that's going on in the 1700s with Locke. He says personal identity is built throughout a person's life, but doesn't exist from birth. So it's the tabula rasa, the blank slate that you built. All right. And Locke says that person is a forensic form of word. That's a quotation. And forensic, and people think that, and I think television, detectives and all that, but forensic has to do with empirical science and being able to establish things through trial and error and testing. So it's testing it out. Well, forensic is also very much located in his time and well into ours in the legal basis. So it's a forensic word, which means it can be changed.
Yeah. And that's a funny that's a strange quote, right? Because I think that it's correct in terms of what I was saying earlier, right? The dangers of inclusion and exclusion. But at the same time, if we think about what sort of empirical or forensic tests have been taken to understand what establishes someone as a person, really, we're still going back to these philosophers from 300 years ago. We haven't made much progress in terms of what the criteria are for establishing what a person is.
Exactly. And that, it's interesting historically. People think that the 2010 decision that our Supreme Court made that companies are people. They have personhood. That wasn't the first time that happened. The basis for that was late in 1856 in the country. And we know what was happening in the late 1850s.
Yeah.
Right. And so that was all forensic. It was all bound up in who could be considered a person and who can't, and who's excluded and who's included. And those words, inclusion particularly, is completely under attack these days. And so again, the incendiary stuff is there, but the forensic nature of it can't be ignored. And that's why it's always up for grabs. A court can decide whether you're a person or not.
Yeah.
And most of the people on this planet, and this is the really stunning thing, and you probably ran into this too as you're reading and preparing for this, the dominant number of people on this planet don't have personhood status in a forensic sense. They aren't considered people in a formal sense.
Yeah. So this highlights the importance of the topic, right?
Yeah.
What the stakes are right off the bat. And so that raises a good question, right? Which is, can only humans be persons, right? And so if most of the people on Earth don't reach that criteria, can anything else besides a human reach that criteria?
Well, yes, and that's the fascinating thing, is it referencing the earlier thing, companies in the borders of the United States, or I don't know, probably if there's a U.S. company that's in Ireland, it has the same status. Companies are considered people when some people aren't considered people. All right. AI is being debated. One of our topics. It's being challenged a lot, whether that is going to be able to consider personhood. And we have to, and then we can look at the criteria that people have tossed out for what makes personhood in a minute. But animals, you referred to Leo, and there are people who have been Pete Seeger and so on, Singer rather, and many all back at least a couple hundred years, but asserting the personhood of certain animals, the great apes. It was in the news, I forgot to send it to you this past week, of trying to establish the whales. Because if you establish personhood in the forensic, in the legal sense, then you have to rethink how you're treating these beings.
Yeah, and there's an interesting thing that comes up here, right? Where if you use the criteria that Locke had sort of developed, then a lot of these animals would meet that criteria. Dolphins, apes, like you said, they can look in a mirror and recognize that they're looking at themselves, right?
Right.
But the thing is, with personhood, as we have been discussing, comes certain protections. And so, the sort of, ascription of personhood kind of demonstrates what the people who are determining personhood are choosing to protect, right? And
yes, because they have a stake in it.
Right. And so it's not surprising then to see business entities being described as persons, whereas, animals are not.
And potentially some people, and right. See that Locke was also trying to establish what, and then Kant, a moral capacity, which would be the capacity in part for self-control. So that throws another wrench in the works. So you determine personhood. You're determining which individuals have human rights, because then we go to the word human, and responsibilities. All right, so if a child is a person and has personhood, but the child can't, the child clearly needs guidance, and the child, so there's that element of protection or oversight, however you want to put it. And for a long time, and I think it's still the case, I don't know if it's the bonobos, but one of that family doesn't seem to be able to get past, maybe chimpanzees don't seem to get past a 3-year-old level of language acquisition. Well, whose language are they acquiring?
Right.
Right. And therefore they aren't full capacity adults. And so someone else has to speak for them. And so then we get that layering, that complexity moving into things.
Yeah. And this is something that it wasn't spoken of explicitly in the book, but a similar sort of concept arose that I think translates well. You got me a book, The Weirdness of the World,
yes.
Talks about consciousness and cosmology, among other things, and how things are kind of bizarre. And one of the aspects of this that they looked at was trying to describe pain, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how, determining how humans feel pain and what pain is, depending on how you describe it, you get into weird situations where all of a sudden animals can't feel pain. For if you brought a space alien down, the space alien couldn't feel pain, right? If you define it
in a certain way.
Yeah, in a materialistic kind of way. And this is where we find that, definitions that on face value may seem perfectly applicable, when extrapolated to wider circumstances tend to fall apart. And I think the personhood is sort of a good example of that, where, rather than, it seems that rather than starting with a core concept, it's more of it's a bit of a deductive process, right? People have throughout time looked at, okay, what describes a human being, right? Rather than what makes a person.
Yep.
And now you understand that's sort of vague and abstract, and it might be helped out by talking about some of the criteria that people have used to describe what a person is.
I happen to have some of them. Okay, consciousness, and especially the capacity for suffering.
So there's pain.
Yep. 2, the ability to reason, which is fraught in itself, because we have these constructs of what we mean by reason. 3, self-motivated activity. In other words, agency or autonomy. But self-motivated activity is a wide range, isn't it?
Yeah. Yep.
The capacity for communication. My cat has it. I know yours does.
Yeah.
Self-awareness, i.e. the concept of oneself as a distinct individual.
Yeah. So every single one of these, right? I feel like you can look at examples and realize that, basically it's not cut and dry, right? In any scenario, So if we start with, all right, so let's start with suffering, right? There's a lot of people, and the Weirdness of the World book, right, spelled this out, where there's a lot of people that don't believe entities as smart as dogs can actually feel pain, right? And then there's other philosophers, like David Chalmers and them, who say, well, a thermostat could probably feel pain. And you go, well, that doesn't seem intuitive either, right? And but I think that, right, if you just use, and of course the book rails against common sense, right? Common sense is a bad guide to knowing things. But I think that if you look at mammalian animal life, right, and you put them into some kind of pain, you cut off a limb or something and you see the way they act, it seems pretty clear that they have the capacity to suffer. Right?
Yes.
And so that one seems pretty easy.
Like cows.
Yeah.
That's why a woman, I've forgotten her name and I'm doing a disservice by forgetting her name, a person, essentially in the process of all the high-level manufacturing of cows or meat, designed a kind of corridor so the cows wouldn't see what was coming. And this is used in some meat companies, at least. But what does that imply? That implies that they can anticipate.
Right.
It implies that they know something is wrong. It implies that something bad is going to happen. It implies fear.
Yeah.
All of those things.
Yeah, which leads us into the next criterion, right? Which is the ability to reason. Mm-hmm. That is a very, sort of nebulous term, right? Because the ability to reason, well, what you just described with the cows sure seems like the ability to reason. Oh, hey, I'm seeing other cows getting killed. I'm probably getting killed. Yeah. And then, observing the reactions that the cows have to this. Obviously, if the cows didn't react, there would be no reason to build these corridors, right?
Right.
It brings me back to the video episode that we did, Life Makes Death Possible, when the anesthesiologist was talking about the single-celled paramecium.
Yes.
And how he was talking about, this thing has the ability to, find mates, to eat, to do these things. So where do we draw the line on what's rationality? What's self-guided behavior, right? Because you could make the argument that these very basic things that we've always sort of eschewed as instincts or as whatever, right? The ability to seek out food, the ability to seek out mates, right? Every animal does it, so it's not important.
Yeah.
But isn't it in some way a self-guided, rational behavior to engage in things that lead to those outcomes, right?
Yeah.
Why do but instead we focus on higher level things like elephants' ability to feel grief or whales' ability to use names and these sorts of things, which are very important, right?
They are.
Well, that's my whole point is, where do we draw this line?
Why are we drawing the line?
What is rational and what is self-guided?
I back up and say, why are we drawing the line?
Right.
Because I question the motives, and that's what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Really, Charles Mills, a fine writer, had an article a year ago, and it was titled, I've got it in front of me, but good read, The Political Economy of Personhood. And so as you can suss from the title, it's what is useful, expeditious to the ideology or the economic structure of a society to determine personhood. So, of course, if you want to make sure that you've established, I don't know who we're proving it to each other, I guess, that we're better than other creatures because we have the capacity to reason. I won't be specific, but I'm just going to say I haven't seen a lot of that demonstrated these days. So you have a hard time arguing to me that there's a high level capacity for reason in humans that is exclusive to humans. But it's useful to say that because after all, we've got to have these other industries that use other animals. And if we don't declassify them, or rather we narrowly classify them, then we're getting into territory that's very uncomfortable.
Right. And so that's kind of getting at the heart of what I'm trying to get at, which is that when we're sort of describing and defining personhood, we're using criteria that are human-centric, right? We're not talking about rationality generally. We're talking about human rationality. How do animals measure up to human rationality? And it's not at all clear to me why that's the metric we should use, because when you look at it, what do humans use their rationality for, right? To find food, to find mates, to have shelter, to prosper as a species. But prospering as an individual within a species to humans looks vastly different than it does to a mantis shrimp, right? But the mantis shrimp is using a variety of extremely complicated tools, including the most complicated optical system of any known species, in order to accomplish its goals. So its rationality, right, is certainly not going to at all represent human rationality, but that doesn't mean that the rationality isn't taking place. And I think that this example becomes more poignant when we start thinking about space aliens or AI, right?
Yeah.
So it's easier to use this in examples of things that are equally or exceptionally more intelligent than human beings, right? If a space alien comes down and, oh, well, it doesn't seem to have any capacity to communicate with us. Its behavior seems completely random and erratic. We have no idea. It doesn't seem to be self-guided at all, right? But it flew here in a spaceship, right? You go, well, maybe we're using the wrong standards, the human standard, to determine what makes this thing a person, what makes it an individual.
I like that example because there are a number of people who like to go to the alien example because it lends itself so well to it. When you set up a situation where the word person is not coextensive with the word human, and the alien example helps bring us right back to that. You're saying, I'm a human being, but I'm not a person. We've done it. Every culture has done it in one way or another, and we continue to do it. And we do it not just with race, but we do it with gender politics, and it's dangerous and it's harmful. But it's easy to dehumanize. But we don't even have to dehumanize because we can just say you're human, but so what? You're not a person. We've gotten to that place.
Yeah. Yeah, you can take somebody who does meet all the criteria for personhood and just ignore those criteria, right?
Yeah.
So it doesn't surprise us when we look at animals, right, and say, well, does it have the capacity to suffer? Well, it doesn't say ouch when I poke it, so no.
Yeah, because it can't say that.
Right.
But if you accidentally step on the paw of a dog or a cat, you know that it hurts.
Yeah.
Can I prove that I know that it hurts? Well, I can go by the empirical analysis of yow and running away, or claws going whack.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that the one that probably sticks out to people, there's probably a lot of people out there, right? Like, yeah, okay, but you're bandying about the wrong things, right? Really what it boils down to is consciousness. So,
yeah.
And I think that here's where an important sort of distinction takes place, right? Is consciousness or sentience a precondition for personhood?
Because consciousness and sentience aren't the same thing, right?
Exactly. So we're gonna have to pick it apart.
Are both of them, either of them?
Yes, it's either of them a precondition
for personhood. The Kant and Locke and their ilk would say yes. Jeremy Bentham, not so much, because Jeremy Bentham's the one that said, I don't care about consciousness or not, I care about suffering. And so he's the one that launched all of that. There's a writer, a very recent writer, who says that the ontological features of someone, rationality or the capacity for moral agency is one thing. Identity, referring to the other those features of someone that distinguishes them from other people, that's become equally important, or somewhat important in the definition. So if I'm conscious that I'm different than other people, just because I'm differentiated from other people, okay, that makes me a person? Well, all right. That means that every child on the planet is conscious. All right. Are they sentient? Well, let's redefine sentience. What do you mean by sentience this time?
Well, this is curious, right? Because we can look at official definitions, but I had a question that was sort of occurred to me just now, and I'm wondering what your take on it is. Do you think that the difference between consciousness and sentience is that consciousness possesses self-consciousness?
Well, I'll start with a safe buffer. I think that that's a distinction that has been pretty readily established in philosophical circles and material.
So then I think that
I'm not trying to run away from it. I just
no. It was off the cuff, and it's a huge question, and I'm not sure where I fall on it really, but it was just something that occurred to me.
Yes.
But regardless of what the answer is, I think that it sort of highlights that the crux of part of the issue is self-consciousness and what we mean by that. And so, and again, scientists, right, have tried to devise tests to determine this in animals, right? The dot test, where you put a dot on an animal's face and then you put it in a mirror and see if the animal tries to get the dot off, because that shows that the animal recognizes the mirror image as itself. But again, this sort of fails to consider the fact that an animal's rationality might lead it to not care or not engage or whatever, but self-consciousness, right? The ability to think of yourself,
to conceive of yourself in fantastical places, in fictive places, in real places, in past or in future. We're back to that,
right? Yeah, I'm not certain at all. Yeah,
but sentience is the awareness of stimuli.
Yeah, so it's sort of like, if I was a purely sensational individual, right? So I could see, hear, touch, feel, taste, and even experience, right? In the present moment, things that are happening. But I might not necessarily have the ability to project into the future or remember the past, even if I could modify my behavior based off of past circumstances. I might not have any distinct memories of the past. And then, yes, the imagination and the creative ability to imagine fictional scenarios wouldn't necessarily be there. Would that sort of we'll call it a zombie, right? Would that type of zombie human be a person, do you think?
I think so, albeit a suffering and a very damaged person. Because fictively, this how many zombie shows have dealt with this kind of stuff? Is that it's not a person anymore? That somebody will yell, "You got to kill it." Well, that's objectification and dehumanizing, and for survival. Okay, within a zombie movie context.
Let's say, right. Our zombie's not trying to eat anybody's brains or anything, right? He's just going about,
being
trying to find
American.
food, trying to find food, trying to find shelter, right? Engaging in social situations.
But
so pretty much acting the way a human being would.
Yes, right? He's engaging in social situations.
But there's no
inner.
Yeah, right.
Or seemingly no inner. Right. Because we don't know.
Have the ability to know.
Right. So yeah, it's a person. I think so.
I think so as well. And I think that if you say yes to that, then I think that sort of opens up the door to view most animals as persons.
It does.
And there's a lot of people that might be screaming at their speakers right now. No, right? What makes us persons is the ability to remember the past and to think about and plan for the future and to do these sorts of things. But I'm going to raise another scenario.
Yeah.
Imagine you have a terrible accident and you're in a coma right now.
Mm-hmm.
and you lose all of those abilities.
Am I still a person?
Yes. Do you want your doctors and your families and your loved ones to still consider you a person when you're in that condition?
Well, I think, well, there's
And there's a distinction to be made here, right? You could want people to pull the plug, but you still want people to consider you a person.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I was about to say that. That's exactly the distinction. If I've done what our society expects of us to express our wishes in a forensically viable manner, i.e., the healthcare proxy or will or all of the different documentations, I don't want to be dehumanized because I'm in a coma. I mean, a person with dementia is still a person, but they have been unlocked from the guardrails that we think that we have established so well in our minds. I mean, they're still a person in my mind because they still can feel. They are suffering, and if not physically, then certainly in a mental capacity. Because to when you have someone come to momentary realization of what's going on, and they come out of a fog, they're going back in. That's knowing that something has happened to you, and I've seen that firsthand. So I absolutely, that's a person. But we go ahead.
Yeah, no. So I think that based off of this sort of high level description, I think that it seems pretty obvious to me that sentience is sort of enough for personhood. But I think that you could even argue that self-consciousness, the sort of the defining factor between sentience and full consciousness, I think there's still probably an argument that you could make that exists at even lower level, right? If we go to cats again, right? I used to have 2 cats. They'd sleep together on the couch. Every once in a while, one would make the other one really angry, and they'd attack each other, right?
Yep.
I think that they're conscious of themselves as being a unique individual. Now, would this translate down to communal insects like ants? Maybe not. But I think most mammals, most reptiles, there's plenty of animals that you could look at that would say, is there self-consciousness? And at that point, the answer would be, what do you mean by self-consciousness? And I think that if it's the basic level of distinguishing yourself as an individual that exists within an environment, and with the capacity to feel pain and to follow goal-directed behavior, that could be defined as self-consciousness at a basic level.
It could. We'll stay with cats. I'm tempted to go into some. We'll stay with cats for now. And most of us who've had a cat, we inevitably will go through the experience of the cat dying. And that happened to me very, very recently. It's happened to me many, many times. But I've seen this in various flavors, but essentially the same kind of process. When the cat is diminishing, the cat removes itself to a quieter, darker space. I call it going into a cave. That cat knows that something is not right and they don't want to be seen. Maybe they feel vulnerable. Even that, even if you don't put anything else with it, they know that something is not, air quotes, right.
Mm-hmm.
with them. And when mine was done, I consulted the vet. They say, you're doing fine. There's nothing we can do here. So they knew what was going on, and the liver had shut down, and the cat was 18. Okay. And we say those things to somehow comfort ourselves, to establish an empirical, we did what we could. But the cat, I finally kept vigil for a night until the cat passed away, and she would make noise and was obviously very uncomfortable, and then roll over and try to sleep, and then make a little noise again and roll over, and I'd reach over and pet, and sometimes the pet was accepted, and sometimes, even though it was so weak, pushed my hand away with a paw. those are decisions. Those are, it's not comfortable. This is comfortable now. It's not comfortable. And I can't have experienced this so many times and say, oh, well, first, they're a lower order of life form. I think not. We're the ones with trucks that barrel along a highway and knock animals out of the way because we just got to get somewhere. I don't put us on a higher plane than in those circumstances. So, yes, I think that it's arguable that mammals have seeming personhood.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, I think that, one of the addendums I had to that question was, talking about free will, but I don't think we really need to, because going into it and what we've talked about so far, I don't think that the free will question really changes much between humans and animals all that much, right? Once you can highlight the differences in rationality and the differences and similarities in goal-directed behavior and in the ability to feel pain, you go, okay, well, it's easy and comfortable to think as animals as automatons that are just, eat, mate, do these things.
Yep.
But then it was sort of like you were saying with the people with the trucks, right? Well, if you're just
cars, but
if you just hit an animal and go about your day, right, and you don't think twice about it, well, that's kind of an automatic behavior. And when I was sort of describing our hypothetical zombie, right, one thing that occurred to me was that there's periods of my day that I go through when I am that hypothetical zombie, right?
We all are.
We're not always self-reflective. We're not always engaging in these higher order human behaviors. There's large sections of the day that we go through where we are just these sensational, sensational automatons, right? And so should our moments of lucidity be enough to rocket us up to the top of the list and to insist that other animals either don't possess them, or that those moments of lucidity are what separates us enough to give us a privileged standpoint that deprives other things of the title of personhood? It seems.
You said the word title. It's right there, because the title is something that is granted, and something isn't granted unless someone who has power is giving something to someone who has a little bit less. Think about, we give you the right now to vote. First, we give you, we say you're not 3/5 of a person. Going back to Black history. Mm-hmm. Okay. So now in our magnificence, our government says, oh, no, you are actually a full person. Until you're not. And what changed?
What changed between when you weren't a person and when you were 3/5 of a person, and now when you're a full person, but you still have disadvantages and in excess.
We give you the right to vote, women. We.
Right.
There's always a we. And that means there's an imperial or capitalistic or whatever word you want to pull with. There's a power that finds itself in the ascendancy and therefore can self-describe nobly give.
So this is a great time to ask, is personhood synonymous with identity, do you think?
There are many philosophers refuse to associate it in a synonymous way with identity. Do I think so? Not exactly, no, because identity is what you conceive of yourself as being, but it's also overlaid with what other people conceive of you and therefore apply labels. And personhood is itself a title, as we've said, but if we believe, I believe, every human being is a person of equal standing. And so I don't need a title to distinguish a human from a person. But does that person have an identity? Well, that depends whether it's an identity that has been conferred by a social structure, or we're talking about an identity of recognizing who and what you are? Because I think everyone has that.
Yeah. It comes down to definition of terms, but I think that they're not synonymous. To go back to Locke's quote, which you're actively describing, right? Personality is a forensic term, or personhood is a forensic term, right? So, you're like we've talked about. Organizations that have the power to confer titles are going to use certain criteria in order to, provide personhood to certain entities. Whereas identity, it depends on how you construe it. But I think that it's pretty safe to say that an individual can have their own sense of identity that is outside of, it's not a forensic term, right? It's a subjective sort of view of who and what you are. Now, you can use a wider definition of identity that includes social interactions. So how do those socio-relational conditions interact with personhood?
More specifically, let's say a text interaction or a going to the coffee shop interaction.
Yeah, I'll use sort of a drastic example to get across some of what the relevance is, right? Let's pretend that a million years in the future, somehow humanity's lucky enough to still be around, right? And what they find out is that the trees on Earth are actually Ents, right?
Okay. Yep.
But they're so...
Thank you, Mr. Tolkien.
Right. They're just really long-lived. And so, it takes a long time before they can speak and act and do things, right? So during the lifetime of a human, or even generations of humans, you never see this behavior. And so you just assume that a tree is a inanimate object, right? So in that case, the social aspect of how individuals and species relate sort of determines how one group might be treated based off of conceptions.
Okay.
So, and again, that's an extreme
I like
example.
the scenario. That's fine.
Yeah, it's an extreme example, but so if we bring that back to, again, we could talk about species, we can talk about different groups of people who have certain characteristics, different demographics, around the world. But how does the social context influence personhood, given the wider definition of identity that we're kind of talking about now?
The social context influences it a lot because social context is manipulated or guided or enforced through a structure that is considered normalcy. We know what normal is. We'll define it, even if it wasn't normal, because that lets us exclude anything that isn't what we say normal is. So the trees wouldn't be considered normal because they're living in a spatial temporal context. In your example, that has it's inevitable that there's not going to be able to be interaction of any communicative kind because of the distance in time of one word being uttered by the tree, and it might be 200 years for humans. Reminds me of a John Cage composition of the composer who one note is played each year, so it's going to take hundreds of years to finish or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that music? And of course it is. If it's using notes and it's planned out and there's an agreement that it's going to be played no matter who's pushing the buttons, there's a lot to that.
Yeah, but time is working its way into our discussion of personhood, which is very interesting. And it raises two scientific articles that I read this week that will sort of demonstrate a relevance to this discussion, right? One was that they've done some study and they're thinking that social status might influence height in future generations. And you think about this in people who are at the top, right? And whether it's better nutrition or, better posture or these sorts of things versus people at the bottom. And you go, well, how could somebody's posture influence, height in a future generation? Well, that's the other study, right? Is they found that there's a phylogenetic passing on of memory through DNA. They're just starting to be able to look at this, where things that are learned by an individual in one generation are passed on to another individual. And this isn't a species-wide adaptative natural selection type situation. It's a type of situation where they exposed an individual of a species to a very specific hazard, right? So normally this thing that they like, this species likes, this food that they like, they tainted it, right? Mm-hmm. And they put a marker in there that sort of signaled to the animal that it was tainted. And what they found is that generations later, right, you breed some generations of fruit flies, or I can't remember what the species was, but down the line, those animals' offspring still have an aversion to that food that the species as a whole loves.
Yeah.
When the marker is
corvids are
produced,
this way.
Right?
Corvids are this way. Crows will remember. There've been I remember very specifically. It was presented in a documentary, but it was also written up that somebody with a red cap pulled down over this. They'd climb up to a tree where the crow mom and babies are and scare it, and then go back down the tree, and the crow would behave differently when somebody came along with a red cap, or indeed certain they stretched it to certain facial distinctions, and the babies remembered when they grew up, they were averse to the red cap kind of thing. So yeah.
So what these kind of demonstrate is the importance of the social context in our identities and our personhood, right? Because all of a sudden you start to realize that things that you wouldn't normally think of as having any effect on who you are can. Things that didn't even happen to you, things that might have happened to your mother or your father or your grandparents.
Can.
And they've found this with Holocaust survivors as well, is that their grandchildren, right, are at heightened risk of certain conditions that are based off of, extremely high stress hormones, right? Mm-hmm. Despite never being exposed to, the Holocaust itself. So we'll wrap up with this last question. Can personhood be gained and lost?
Yes, because states establish it. I mean, I say yes, but I'm not being glib. Because
it raises, so I guess we can change that question, right? Because based off of our previous conversation, we know the answer to that. I think that a deeper question might be, is there a conception of personhood that doesn't fall into the forensics that Locke was talking about? Or at that point, are we talking about identity or something else?
Well, I think there is where it is interlocked with identity, because I believe that I will always know, unless I lose my memory, that I'm a person, and that the people in the street that I encounter are people too. And no matter what somebody defines it as or overlays a status rule about, so deeply inside, from the identity point of view, yes, by genetics or by life experience or philosophy, ontology, whatever, people are people. And they aren't the same, but they are human beings who have, in my mind, the same rights, even though those rights aren't granted. An entity can take rights away. But that doesn't mean I think they should have been, and it doesn't matter whether I think they should have been or not if they're taken away. then it's incumbent on me to somehow try, when people ask for help, to figure out how to do the things they would have been able to do if they still had those rights. So that would say that I believe that people have the inherent rights.
Yeah. So personhood, as we've discussed, there's a legal sort of overlay to it.
An exterior.
Yes, there's a legal and sort of overlay and power structure to it. But intuitively, subjectively, each one of us can identify personhood in others, right? Is there any other, when we look at science or any other, how do we qualify personhood, right? Because I think that here's the thing, from the legal standpoint, then personhood can be gained and lost.
Yeah.
But from a subjective standpoint, then, right, is there ever a time where I would look at something and say it is a person and now it's not a person, right? I don't know that is very clear then.
I have to, the first thing that jumps into my mind is something that you had some experience with. And I don't know because I haven't had the experience, but my impression is that in order to teach people in a military context to kill others, there is some process of dehumanizing or decoupling personhood from a target. Is that fair to say? Is there any that so in other words, it's harder if I'm going to shoot somebody who I think is just like me, equal status, than it is to take somebody out who's an enemy. And I'm not saying any of this lightly. I don't have the firsthand experience, but psychologically, I think that's partly what goes on.
Yeah. No, and the military has gone to lengths to design targets and to design training in order to reduce that aspect.
So there's your question.
So I think that's a good highlight. I think another good highlight might be depersonalization, for depersonalizing events that people undergo. Psychologically traumatic experiences, and where people they don't recognize themselves. Is that just a loss of identity, or is it a loss of personhood? I think that might be,
That's an interesting question, because I think it depends on how long the situation lasts and whether people in Gaza can't sleep or can't find basic food, and watching people starve in front of them and all the things that, again, horrors. Does that change your view of humanity? I would guess probably. Does it change your view of, have you been rendered less than a person? Well, there's attempts to render you that way. I don't know that you have that. That's what goes on in the mind, though. I think is do you feel like a person? Do you know you are? Those are two different questions.
Yeah, and I think that on the depersonalization track, right, there's very rare diseases in which if you have brain damage, you have two brain regions that are responsible for identifying faces. And if the one gets damaged, you sort of perceive everybody in the outside world to have been replaced with an imposter, right? But if the other brain damage the other region gets damaged, you can no longer identify your own face. And so that at face value seems to be sort of, sort of seems to be like, oh, okay, well, that would be a problem, but what's the consequence of it? The consequence is that these people no longer believe they're alive, right? And a lot of them end up dying through various means, right? Either thinking that they're invincible and immortal, or through thinking that they're already dead, so dangerous things won't have any effect on them. And then they end up getting hit by buses or things because they just don't take proper precautions to care for themselves, right? So in that case, you could almost say that that's a loss of personhood in a way, right? The person themselves no longer recognizes, and of course, it really illustrates how wrapped up identity and the ability to identify is with personhood. Right?
Yeah.
You can't identify your face, then you sort of lose your sense of person.
You lose yourself. I mean, that's profoundly, that's a very troubling and interesting situation. Another one comes to mind. And this is a forensic thing again. This will date the episode, but yesterday the Supreme Court released a decision that homeless people do not have a right to sleep on the street. Well, that sounds really nice and tidy, doesn't it? There we do. Clap your hands. We're all taken care of. But what is it saying? It's saying, as one of the justices, the dissenting justice, Sonia Sotomayor, said, sleep is a basic human need. And you are removing personhood from the people who have no other place to be because there are not enough shelters and all this kind of thing. So it's a horror, it's awful, but it's another example of ability to reconceptualize through law what is allowed and what isn't. Well, sleep's not allowed now.
And the purpose of it is to make public spaces and social relational aspects easier among people who are more privileged.
Right. And so it's going to be arrest. And one of the other judges said, you can't arrest your way out of this, which was a phrase that I really liked. But the point is that the personhood is malleable from within with our genetics or exposure to damage or accidents. It's malleable from without because of social structures and law, forensic stuff. So it is not a safe, static entity or concept.
Yeah. Yeah, so this has been really interesting and a lot of fun, and I'm sure that it's going to play into future conversations we'll have. So until next time, keep pondering.